Okay, here's the photograph we're going to be working from. Just pines in fog, and the pines themselves are pretty much straightforward. I want to try to keep this more or less a stylized type of watercolor. It will be fairly loose, but then what we could also do is just make the pine trees a little bit loose, and they're going to just be gobs of paint, so to speak. Now there's so many different ways you could paint pines in watercolor. These will kind of be halfway between detailed and loose, kind of defining the branches, but not every last little needle, so to speak. When we start our gray wash for the sky and for the beginning of the fog, what we'll do is we're going to put these distant trees in while the background is still wet. And then that way they will bleed out into the background and be a very, very soft shape, but they will be a pine in the much distance. And then a lot of these burnt siennas and burnt umbers will all be in the foreground. They'll be a little bit sharper and a little bit more contrasty. Then we could just bring them closer to us. And then we have to make sure that our colors gradate and the value gets lighter and lighter as we go back. Let's go ahead and draw this out and we'll get started and just see what all we could do to more or less render this photo. And again, it's just a reference. We don't have to go exactly by the photo. It's just to give us some ideas of where to place things. Because remember, if you have a good idea of your photograph, of everything the way it is the way you may want it, then your proportions, your shapes, and your composition will already be done for you. Because keep in mind, when I photograph something, a lot of times if I see something out in the wild that I like, I will photograph it just as I would want to paint it. So very few times would I have to make major adjustments of my photograph. Let's go ahead and draw it out and get started. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is take my big flat brush here and put down a wash of just real light grays. That will be my fog, and that's what I'll have to start with. Now what I want to do is, if I want any real distant trees that you could just barely see a color difference but not necessarily an outline, I'll put those in while my fog is still wet. And then I'll also put down a layer of water if I want a little bit of extra time before it starts drying, because then once it starts drying, I'm going to start getting sharp edges. And I may not want any sharp edges yet, especially the distant trees in a fog. They're just going to be a real soft gob of color, and that's about it. I'll also take those grays down into here, and into here. These are all just rock slides where trees or grasses are not growing. So I want those pretty much also on the bluish side, and then everything else down in here where the grass is down here, these will be the yellows and golds, and then the trees will be a very soft green. Now to keep this fog looking like it's real heavy and it's just going to have a very specific look to it, then I want to keep all my colors real soft. I don't want any real intense colors in this particular painting, or they're really going to jump out at you. Let's try our sky wash. Now, what I want to do also then is I have to make sure I leave these dry, these individual coats, because otherwise they'll just keep on building up to a gob of a neutral color of all the colors acted together. So I don't want that. Now this is going on very light. I don't mind if it goes over the trees because they will be darker. And I'll just pull some of that color down into here. And then I'm going to leave it dry a little bit. Okay, now what I'll do next, I'll leave this dry just a little wee bit, and then once the heavy water starts to soak up a little bit, while it's still wet though, then I'm going to start putting just some of the distant trees in, and just the ones that you'll barely be able to see, but that will keep adding depth. And then I have to make sure all of this completely dries before I start putting in any of my foreground trees. Otherwise, they will just keep on bleeding out and I won't have any sharp edges. Now I'm going to use the Windsor blue, which is kind of like a phthalo blue, and the burnt sienna, but I'm going to really thin it out, and then I'm going to get like a grayish green. And I'm going to keep my grays pretty strong in this particular painting, because what it will do is actually keep a specific look to it. Now what I want to do then too also is, if I start adding some of these, I got to be careful with how much water is in it, because what will happen is I'll start getting cauliflowers in my background, and I may not want that either. And these will soften up quite a bit. I can even lift them up a little bit if I want to with a Kleenex. But these would be considered the most distant trees there are in this particular scene. And then the trick is, in this particular setup, lay it down and that's it. Don't play with it. Just leave it go, leave it dry. It's going to lighten up some. But then if I keep playing with it, then I might start lifting paint up. I might start getting light spots. I might start getting shapes that I don't want. And then as long as I could still see my tree outlines of the pencil, where the next ones are going to go, but as long as we have our reference to go by, we don't have to follow it exactly. But what we will do is actually change things a little bit. And I'm going to put just some of these colors down in here and there, just for a little bit of color unity. And again, this will add the complexity. I gotta be careful, because once it starts drying, I'll start getting sharp edges, and I don't want that. But if I get sharp edges down here, like this right here in the foreground, that's okay, because right through here, down from here down, is going to be where my strongest colors are going to be, as far as the most bold that will be the objects closest to you. Now we're going to leave this dry, and then we'll go back in and start pulling out the next layer of trees that will be closest to us. And what we're doing is just working the lightest trees that are the furthest away, then darker, then darker, then darker. But as they keep on getting darker, then those are the ones that will be coming closer and closer to the viewer. Let's leave this dry. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do, if we look on our reference, I'm going to just kind of just mark in some of my grasses, like right in here, down through here. This is the edge of the rock right here, just to mark where they're going to be, and then just put a little wee bit here and there. And if I keep everything real light, I could always make anything darker, or even change it into rocks with just a glow of a yellow to it. And then this will be grasses up in here, and then I might even put a little wee bit right up in here. But then what I'll do is make this look more distant, and I'm going to start putting in the pine trees after that dries. But I want to make sure each one of these coats dry, because if I put down these golds and just like a grayish gold for the grass, if I don't let it dry, then it's going to keep on mixing up and muddying up my nice clean goldish grays that I would want for the grasses in the foreground. Just drop a little bit of burnt sienna here and there. Let it blend in and bleed in while it's wet. I gotta be real careful with how much I put in here because this is the distant. This might be drying already. I gotta be careful there too. Just want a little bit here and there. Now if I get some sharp edges and some loose edges, soft edges, that's okay. That's what I'm looking for. That I'll make those sharp edges into something once they dry. Use my watercolor eraser. We'll leave that go just like that. And next we'll leave that dry, and then we'll start putting in our trees that'll be closer to us. There's a very light coat of gray over everything. You can probably see it by the difference between the white of the board, the PVC board, and the paper. Okay, this is dry enough. What I want to do is start bringing out some of the distant trees that will be closer than the ones we put in while the sky was still wet. Now what I want to do though is these next trees I could probably get by with just one layer of value, so to speak, and then that's it because they're still far back, but they're going to have sharper edges. But what I want to do though is if you look at some of the trees in the foreground, they even have a little tinge of gold to them that I want them to have at least 3 or 4 different values then as I start bringing them closer, because I want them to have some kind of shape. If I only make them one value the whole way across, then they're going to look fairly flat. If I start building in different values in the foreground trees, then I want them to take on some type of a shape. Let's go ahead and put some in. And right now I'm just destroying some of the straight edges just to have some very soft edges, but also some little bit on the sharp side. And I'm still trying to keep my values as light as possible. If I think they're getting a little bit too dark, then I could dab it with a Kleenex, but then I also know that they're going to lighten up. And then if I fade it off into nothing, that is the safest way to leave it, because then I can always build it back up on the tree side or the grass side, either one. And then again, these are very specific colors I'm using. On this next one, I might use a little wee bit more blue. These are going to be in a distance too. But I also would be considering just to mix up the values of the trees too, so they all don't look identical. And then this is where I could start adding my negative shapes. If I start painting in around here, that would be the grass, but I got to be very subtle about it because this is good ways in. I got some bigger trees closer that I'll put in here. And then I also may drop down in size of my brush just so I could get a little bit more intricate as I go. That'll just bring in more detail to the foreground trees. But these trees I'm making now will definitely go over these soft trees I put in the very beginning. Those are the furthest back. These will be the next set of trees coming closer. And some of these I could maybe add one more layer of values just here and there. But then again, I like blending them off into the white of the paper only because that'll add to the fog effect. And again, these are getting pretty light in value. I can make these trees solid like they are in the photograph, but I think I'd rather just sketch them in the way I am. Very subtle highlights here and there worth having. And also sometimes what you don't paint is just as important as what you do paint. And you can see even the bigger tree that's right here in the photograph, the top appears much darker against the lighter sky than it does down in here up against a darker background. Okay, I'm going to drop down in size and brush, and I'm just going to just kind of work with the French ultramarine, even actually cobalt blue. I'm going to stay with a lighter blue, and then a little bit of burnt umber. I'm going to mix up a real light gray. I'm going to have to water this way down. It's way too thick right now. And this will be just for my rocks. Change the texture. I'll put a little bit more blue in it. Change of texture and a change of pattern. All I'm pretty much doing now is drawing with paint. And again, anything that could go darker, I have no problems there, as long as it has to go darker. And this is just kind of a drawing outline of where the rocks are going to be. Okay, let's leave those dry and we'll start putting in our foreground pine trees. See where they come out at. We got a lot to define. We go a little bit darker, heavier and heavier. And we'll keep defining our pine trees closer and closer. And those are the ones that will define the top of the grass. Because I'll paint those trees darker to come down into here. And then that will define our top of the grass. And they may go down the heel just to follow the contours of everything that's going on. We'll let that dry for a little bit. Okay, here's where we could plan a little bit. Now, if I put this next tree in right here, it's going to be pretty close. Not as close as these trees right here, but it's already going to start darkening up a good bit. But then what I want to do then is, do I end that tree right in here and then save this for lower brush that's going to be higher than the grass but lower than the pine tree itself. But what I'll have to do though is, if the middle-sized vegetation has highlights to it on the top, then I want to stop the tree so far down and leave some space for my highlights of the brush, and then that would be deeper down here, but then that would define the highlights of the top of the grass. So I'm starting off with a positive shape, but ending with a negative shape of the object behind it, below it, or in front of it. And what I'm doing now is just starting off real light water, lots of water over here, going to more and more color back here. Then that way I want to start just real light to make sure I don't start off too dark, because I can always leave it dry and then add complexity to it by giving it another layer. But what I want to do is just be careful not to start off too dark too quick. Because once I start doing this light, remember I could start painting some darks in and around here to make it look like light areas of branches coming at you, instead of just branches going this way, branches going that way, and that's it. And these trees have a very unique shape to them also. And in this particular case right here, this might even be two trees stacked up on top of each other. I have to wait till this dries before I put another layer on it, otherwise it's just going to keep on puddling up like this, and I won't be able to build up my layers as long as it's wet. Put another one right here. And then this one's a little bit deeper green than this one, so this is the one I want in front. And I'll leave those puddles there. They'll dry darker and be the deeper shadows between the foreground middle brush and the background tree. We gotta leave those dry first. I'll start with a coat of a little bit more yellow just to draw this one in, but it will be in front of everything. Now if I want lighter trees down here, then I'll stop, and I could put a couple smaller trees right in here, but then I gotta stop my colors and let them be painted around, negative space only. And we'll shape these trees up after these dry. Then I'll put some burnt siennas and browns down in here. That would be the middle brush again. And that is like this brush that's down in here. That will be darker and go over everything. It'll be dark enough to go over the edges of the rocks and then the grass, and we'll define that. We'll let that dry. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is put these couple trees in right here. These are the biggest ones, probably about out of all of them. And I'm going to start off with the quinacridone gold, just like I did with this one. Just start it off. Now this tree back here appears like it's coming in front, but this tree has to go a good bit darker, so it will be darker than this one. So we're planning ahead, and then even down in here, I have to figure out whether I want to make some low brush or even some small pine trees by the looks of it, and then I could make those. But then again, remember, when I'm coming down with this tree, I'm painting the positive space of this one, but then I'll be indirectly painting the negative space of what's down in here. So if there's low brush that has highlights on it, I have to paint around those, and then that way I will literally be painting two different shapes at once. So when I get to those kind of places, I have to be a little bit careful, because I might be wanting to paint in branches for this tree, but at the same time I may have to be painting around branches or brush for this more or less middle vegetation down here. That we pretty much still have, again, 3 levels of vegetation: the grass, the low brush, and then the pine trees. Let's go ahead and put these in now. I'll mix up some quinacridone gold. And again, I'm going to start out real light. And right now I'm concentrating on the outside perimeter of the entire tree, where the branches are going. And later on I could fill in the gaps. And while it's wet, if I want, I got to be careful. But I could take some darker colors and just spot them here and there, just to give a little bit of that classic traditional watercolor action that will start to bring on my darker shapes towards the center of the tree or the bottoms of the branches. I want to rinse that out as I'll go back to my lighter gold. And then this one right here could kind of join in right with that tree. They could be pretty much side by side, for lack of better words. But this one here will be in front of this one. And that will all depend on how far I take these down. If this one stops right in here and this one stops down in here, then these 2 trees should be in front of that one. And I don't mind some of that daylight that's in between. And as I keep on adding colors, it'll get more and more complex. These couple have to go a good bit darker. This one has to go a good bit darker. I'm going to even make these a little wee bit darker just by barely adding an extra coat. And then these back in here, again, I could blend them off into the white of the paper, make it look like a low ground fog also. And then just pick and choose what I'm going to do, whether it be a little wee tree with no leaves on here or there, define the rocks a little bit more. What I want to do is add a little bit of burnt sienna as just a low brush. I'm going to tone it down with the greens. Now I'm looking for shapes. And I could follow the shapes of what I already have. Okay, I think you got a rough idea what I'm going to do here. And just showing you, I'm going to go ahead and do some speed painting just to get the majority of this done, and then we'll stop and take a look. This has to dry yet. The paper's still curled. It's still cold. That definitely tells you it's wet. I'm going to dry it off and then start giving extra layers on these couple trees, and then even like back in here, just to add a little wee bit of form. So it's just not one flat color the whole way across. They'll be very light in values added to that, but all 3 or 4 layers added up will give me a little bit more of a cylindrical form of a tree versus just a flat silhouette looking tree. Let's go ahead and do some speed painting. Right now I'm just adding additional layers to what is already there. The quinacridone gold was mixed down a little bit with the raw umber, and then I mixed up the muted green, which is actually Windsor blue and burnt sienna. That gives me a real grayish green that works well with this type of a painting based on the reference I'm using. Now remember, when I put down colors, one thing you may want to think of is, number one, the base coat has to be really dry if you want to really build up texture. Otherwise, you'll just keep flooding that same layer of paint with more and more additional paint and not be able to build up additional texture or shapes. And then also the additional colors that you put down on top of already dried paint may look, or probably should look, a lot darker than what you really need. Then be patient, and once it dries, it will start to blend in with the rest of your composition, contrast, and colors you already have down. Let's take a look and see what we have. Okay, let's take a look and see what we have. Now, I put some of the distant deciduous trees in. Barely you could see them. The trees we put in with the sky are barely noticeable now because the darker, sharper edge trees are grabbing our attention. Now, I wasn't going to put too many sharp edges in at all, but I still think it has that slight fog effect. But then also I do think I like the snappier colors and shapes in the foreground. It just adds more depth to a foggy picture, only because if I leave everything soft, then it'll start to lose depth. It would be the same thing as making everything dark the whole way to the back, that if I leave everything light the whole way to the front, is the exact same thing, that I'll just lose my depth with darker colors in the foreground, lighter colors in the background. That creates an instant atmospheric perspective. Now this in here, I just threw in a little wee bit of faint purples, the dioxazine purple and the cobalt violet, just in the rocks here and there. I could define them a little bit, but I have to be careful not to go too dark. But I think, again, I already went darker than the photograph itself, so I don't think I would mind maybe just picking out some details here and there, just where I want some highlights of interest, so to speak. Let's go ahead and finish this one up, and then we'll see what we got at the very end. At the end of the painting is usually the script work, is all the sharp edges and finer detail that makes a painting look more complex than it really is. This is nothing more than drawing with color. Let's take a look at our final thoughts. Okay, I went ahead and just made these just a little wee bit darker, left some of my highlights at the top of the grass and the lower brush, and then some of the middle brush I just put in just like some dead leaves. And while the stems were wet, I put in straight burnt sienna, and what they did was bleed together the stem color and the leaf color, and it just gave a little wee bit of a mixture watercolor action, so I just don't have pure burnt sienna leaves there. They blend a little bit just to give a little bit of mixture as I went. I touched down a little bit of white on the outside of the tree trunks, and then this way that would look more like where the light is coming from over in here, and just more or less giving a little bit of a highlight. But again, that could also be rime ice, and I had a video about that previously, and what that is fog up in the top of the mountains that will actually freeze as it's going over, and it just keeps on building up on the windward side, and it will make your tree trunks, anything that it sticks to, flowers, low brush, pure icy white, and then that it kind of looks out of place if you don't know what it is. Now everything else I just kind of roughed in, just leaving the contrast fairly low. I made it more than the photograph, but I think I liked it a little bit better with a little bit more contrast in it. Now this one I would just consider pretty well finished. I could go back over, do a little bit of things, but for the sake of this demo and video, we'll call it quits. And again, until I see you out in the field or back at the studio, thanks for watching.